All right, check.
Yeah.
Today we are going to be talking about the Admiral Wilson Memo. You may have heard
Okay.
this referred to by other names, the Wilson Davis notes, the Core
Hmm.
Secrets Memo, things like that. But mostly I hear Admiral Wilson Memo. Before we dive
Okay.
in, have you heard anything about this?
So actually, you already hit on my first question. I basically have not, but I read very briefly through the Wilson memo, and it's like unreadable to me. Like it requires a lot of
Yeah.
parsing. But I did hit on the core secret thing, and I had never heard that term before. Is this
Yeah.
is this a clearance, or what is that? Or am I just
I
like digging
believe
straight
so.
in too fast?
Well, so this is part of the problem, right? Like, I'm not a military guy. You have some
Mm-hmm.
military connections in your family, but you're also not
Yeah.
a military person.
Yeah.
So some of the terminology, I don't know. Is this
Okay.
made up terminology? Is this real terminology? Is this terminology that only a select group use and it
Sure.
sounds
Yeah.
made up, but is actually totally common in high? I
Yeah.
don't know. Um,
Okay. All right.
my
Fair.
understanding is I don't know about you. When I was growing up, I was under the impression that like top secret was a clearance
Yeah.
level and above top secret was the next one up. And like,
Right.
yes, those classifications exist, but in modern compartmentalized programs, much more often it's less about the classification level and it's more about who has need to know. And that is, in
Oh.
fact, at the core of what we're going to talk about today is that, in a nutshell, what this is about is Admiral Wilson found out about one of these UFO programs, allegedly,
Hmm.
and went to talk to them. And on paper, he has the clearance needed. And they told him, you don't have a need to know. So they've
Okay.
got a thing called a bigot list, which is actually an acronym I found out. Yeah, it sounds like,
Okay.
whoa, hold
It's
on.
like,
But
tell me
if I
more.
remember right, it stands for uh, British invasion of Germany over, but it was a World War II thing, and it
The end
literally
of.
referred to they were
I.
planning an operation, and it was who was
Okay.
cleared to know about this operation. And that word
You
bigot list has
you
just
were
stuck around.
about to say overtime, weren't you? Like any
I
acronym that
no,
ends in
okay, now
OT.
I got to look it up. Bigot
It's
list.
like, oh yeah, this is their DOT.
Okay, a bigot list. Oh God, there's like debate over what it means.
All right.
One common
Let's. Damn it.
etymology is that bigot is a reversal of the code words to Gibraltar.
What? Oh, to
Yeah,
jib.
but but again, it was the name of a particular
Hmm.
operation in World War II, and the word bigot list was used to indicate who was cleared to know about it. So anyway,
Interesting.
all
Okay.
of that is to say, I don't actually know what a core secret is, but
Okay.
I the
Context.
context makes it clear this is something that I am not at liberty to discuss,
Sure. Yeah.
whatever that means.
Cool. All right.
Okay,
I'm on board. So yeah, I don't know
so
much. I
yeah,
tried reading it. It didn't go well. So I'm excited to hear what the community's interpretation of the thing is. Uh,
yeah,
but
yeah, yeah,
I'm pretty blank right now.
yeah. So I want to say two things before we dive into this. One is this is a stupidly complicated story. There's a lot of
Okay.
names involved, a lot of
Yeah.
things. There's a timeline. Um, the meat of the memo is about Admiral Wilson trying to get into this program. But there's a whole convoluted story around the memo. I'm going to touch briefly on that. I'm going to try to kind of give you the high level overview of what the backstory is here. And really, though, what we want to focus on is this story about Admiral Wilson trying to get access.
Okay.
Um,
Cool.
the second thing I will say is so far, I have been bringing you quote unquote verified material, right? Stuff
Oh.
that Congress approved or that there is a clear,
Okay.
right? Like the Tom DeLonge stuff is controversial, but it was verified by the Podesta email leaks, et cetera, et cetera.
Okay.
We are much more into unconfirmed alleged territory here. So I'm not going to
Okay.
say
Interesting.
that throughout the memo, but you should just understand anything I say should hear allegedly on the backside
So
of it.
like,
Uh,
even though I downloaded the memo from like I thought it was from a .gov. Um,
you did,
it was
which is a fun bit of story. Yeah.
Okay. All right. So it's still not totally confirmed. All right.
Yeah.
I'll
See,
put my
this is
tinfoil
one
hat
of
on.
those things. So, I was talking to you about like, oh, check, UFO videos, the government admitted they're real.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, okay, hold on. This is one of those moments. The UFO community went apeshit at the most
Mhm.
recent congressional hearing about UFOs because one of the senators asked the Pentagon reps, have you heard of the Admiral Wilson memo? Can you
Okay.
confirm whether it's real or not? And their answer, of course, was, I've never heard of it. And he said, I would
Interesting.
like to enter the Admiral Wilson memo into evidence.
Yeah.
So everyone's like, holy shit, Congress admitted the Admiral Wilson memo is real. No, they did nothing of the sort. Like,
They
he could
admitted it
have brought a
exists.
fiction book. Yeah, have you ever heard of William Shatner's book, Tech War? Okay, I would like
Right.
to enter
Yeah.
Tech War. That doesn't make it
Like
real. It makes it
whatever.
a
Yeah.
thing that could be put in the evidence. But
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah.
there's a reason you could find it on a .gov site,
Oh,
and it's
okay.
fun.
So, okay, got it. Interesting. So it was just that they brought it up in an official context,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
there,
yeah, yeah.
but the original source of it is like it's
Still
clearly
controversial.
a
Yeah.
16th
Now,
generation copy of a copy of a copy when you look
not
at it.
only is it controversial, it is explicitly denied by the man himself, Admiral Wilson. Yeah.
Oh,
Now,
popcorn.
but here's the thing. In the memo itself, Admiral Wilson explicitly says to Davis, who he's talking to, if you leak this, if this comes out, I will deny everything. I will deny ever having met you. I will deny knowing you. I will deny everything. And
Interesting.
in the context of talking about this stuff, one of the things they bring up is these compartmentalized military programs. There is a way that you are supposed to talk about these like black budget, oh
Hmm.
God, what's the term? Special access programs.
Yeah,
So the government is full of special access programs. That just means it's a program that only certain people have access to. But
sure.
in theory, all of those are on paper, they're in the budget. Congressional people can do it. Certain people, like the Gang of Eight, have access. There's another category called unacknowledged special access programs. That's where the juicy shit is. That's where they got
Hmm.
the alien autopsies and the
Okay.
captured craft and, all that goofy shit. But by its very definition, if you work for an unacknowledged special access program, if someone comes to you and asks you about it, it is insufficient for you to say no comment.
Sure.
In those contexts, no comment can be taken as a confirmation that the
Sure.
program
Yeah.
exists, but you're not allowed to talk about it. You are explicitly supposed to deny it exists. Like
So that's like the Men in Black
literally, you are
phrase.
supposed to lie about it. Kind of, yeah. But again, that brings us back to Admiral Wilson was very high up in the ranking of who had access to this stuff. He would be very familiar with this protocol. He explicitly tells Davis, if this ever gets out, I will deny it. So while, yes, we have Admiral Wilson on record repeatedly denying the authenticity of this memo, it's also exactly what you would expect him to do if it was true. So the
Makes me want to
only other
write
person,
fiction
right?
where the real names deny it in the fiction.
Yeah,
Like,
100%.
feels like that'd be a really
The
fun
only
way to
other
mess.
name involved in this who could confirm its authenticity is Eric Davis, who we'll talk about in a moment. Uh, Notably, remember what I just told you about no comment? The only
Mhm.
thing Eric Davis has ever said about the memo is no comment.
Now that's
Now,
interesting.
Eric Davis
Or
is
maybe
not a
not.
stupid man. Exactly. It's very deniable. But Eric Davis, I've mentioned him to you before. He was the guy who came out in the New York Times story and testified that he had briefed Congress on crash retrieval programs. He is one of those guys who's very skilled at walking the narrow line of what he is legally allowed to say and dancing right up to the point of violating his security oath. So a lot of people interpret Wilson's vociferous denial and Davis's no comment as both of them acknowledging that it's real, which
Yeah.
is kind of hilarious. But yes,
What
I
is
will
what
I
is
will
Davis's
100%
title?
grant you as a skeptic, this memo, you have plenty of grounds to disbelieve it. So I am not asking you to come out on the other side of this and go, holy shit, the Admiral Wilson document is real, and this, that, and the other. This very firmly falls into the category of, if it's true, it's a very exciting time.
What is Davis's rank or title? Do you know?
So Davis has never he's never been in the military. He's
Oh,
an
okay. Oh,
astrophysicist.
okay.
Um, he worked for a group called the National Institute of Discovery Science, or NIDS, which was a paranormal research group set up by Robert Bigelow in response to the Pentagon funding that we talked
Okay.
about last time. So that project, their contractor was NIDS. So Eric Davis worked for NIDS. He has also done work for NASA on advanced propulsion theory. He has done work for the Air Force. He still holds security clearances. He's one
Okay.
of those guys that's kind of all over the map, but it's not as simple as like, oh, he was a
Yeah,
commander working in this wing of the military or whatever.
that's fine. That makes sense. So I I just get this like I don't know, it's probably my liberalness, but I I wonder how many people big corporations employ to write ridiculous grants. Um,
Yeah.
like Bigelow makes a ton of money off of this, or maybe not a ton, but they make
Mhm.
enough to employ a bunch of people, and maybe they get something interesting out of it. And
I would say the
I don't
opposite
know,
way of looking at that is Bigelow was given a fixed budget by the government, and he
right?
spent every dollar of it on a topic that he cares dearly about, and
Of
probably
course,
did not turn a profit on.
maybe,
Does that mean that there was no potential profit? No, of course not. I think Bigelow is personally interested in UFOs,
sure,
but he also runs an aerospace company. He runs
yeah,
a hotel chain. He is skilled at extracting value. If you get yourself in position to be a government contractor on this kind of stuff, yeah, there's money to be made. So
yeah.
I,
Well, and
I don't
the
blame you for
upside
being
is,
skeptical of hotel magnate with an aerospace company founds
yeah,
a research group that gets a hefty government grant and he employs
right,
some questionable scientists. Fully giving that one to you. That sounds
okay,
sketch as hell.
okay, cool, yeah, we're on the same page. Like, I
Yeah.
the upside is so large that why not
Oh
throw
yeah.
a couple million at
100%.
it or lose a couple million
Yeah.
on it and get some government
Now,
grants and government access.
what I will say about both Robert Bigelow and Eric Davis is one of the most widely respected physicist I have seen anyone talk about. Like anytime he comes up, people are like, Eric Davis is pathologically incapable of lying to the point of pissing people off, right? Like he's one of those like really blunt guys. He tells you what he thinks. He has a absolutely stellar reputation among other scientists. Does that mean he's not off his rocker? No. And, this is all third hand, fourth hand testimony, but he's not. Okay, a better example, the Navy holds a series of patents for things like anti-gravity and warp technology, things straight up science fiction shit. They're all held by this dude named Salvador Payas. Salvador Payas was interviewed last year for the first time on one of the podcasts, and I listened to it. Yeah, he does not sound like a world respected authority. He sounds like the kind of guy who would hold a patent for anti gravity. Now, the counter argument is it's not that easy to get a patent granted by the government on things like this. You're supposed to have a working model of the thing that you get patented. Some of the patents were rejected, but all of that is to say, Salvador Payas does not have that like rock solid. Everybody's like, oh yeah, that dude means business. Eric Davis does. So again, we are in firm hypothetical territory, but this dude, Eric Davis, who's kind of at the center of this memo, does have that really solid reputation. Now, let's talk a real brief timeline because this is the part that I said gets complicated. So we're going to kind of work backwards here. So around 2018, 2019, this memo leaked to the public. It had actually been floating around in UFO circles for a couple years. some big name UFO people mentioned having been shown it, but none of them wanted to be the one to leak it. And what ended up happening eventually was someone put it up on Imager, and nobody knows who did it, but one of these people who had access to it did it. And once it was out, everyone was like, okay, well, shit, like, I'm not going to take the heat on it. You guys are never going to believe what I found on Imager. Like, this is crazy, right? So they all had kind of plausible deniability. The
Okay.
provenance of the memo, and this has been verified, is this came out of the files of astronaut Edgar Mitchell. Edgar Mitchell was the sixth man who walked on the moon.
Okay.
He was a no-nonsense Air Force astronaut dude. He's one of those, the right stuff era kind of guys.
Mm-hmm.
He also claims to have seen UFOs in orbit. He started up a research institute into paranormal stuff and consciousness, and has been a big booster of the UFO topic. Um, so the fact that this came out of his files is interesting, but not necessarily proof of its authenticity. It just means that we know where it came from.
Okay. And
How
like he's
Edgar
acknowledged
Mitchell,
that.
well, the reason it came out of his files is he died in 2016. So no, he has
That
not
okay.
acknowledged it.
Okay.
But we know that it came out of his files because basically his family wanted nothing to do with his UFO stuff. And one of the UFO researchers was able to swoop in and
Oh,
rescue
that's
his
cool.
archives.
Okay, cool. Got it.
Um, the reason Edgar Mitchell allegedly had this memo is because he worked with Eric Davis in NIDS and some other places. So basically, Eric Davis has this meeting with Admiral Wilson. He writes it all down and shares it out with some of the people he works with. It was not shared with the intention of being leaked publicly. This was
Sure.
very much intended to be private, personal research. Wilson even notes, or Davis even notes that in the thing. He is reassuring Admiral Wilson, who is extremely skittish for reasons I'll get into in a minute, that he is not going to blow this up in public. Um,
Yeah. Is this
so
the one thing I couldn't tell about the memo, was it like recorded or do we know?
that's a very interesting question. I don't want to derail too much, but
Okay.
briefly, no one knows, and that's part of the controversy. A common criticism of the memo is it reads like a movie script.
Yeah.
If I had an hour-long meeting with you in the back of a car in Vegas
I wouldn't
and,
remember these details.
some hours later sat down to write it down, I wouldn't be able to transcribe it. Now, Eric Davis is rumored to have a photographic memory. Like, people
Oh,
say this about him. He has a phenomenal memory. But,
okay.
even so, it very much reads like a movie script, which means a lot of people have interpreted it as this is a movie script.
Sure.
It's a weird, boring movie, if so, but whatever.
It's the kind of movie
I
that
wouldn't
Eric
greenlight
Davis
this
would write.
shit.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. Uh, but the other rumor is that Davis literally was recording the conversation. Now, there is no mention anywhere in here of him recording it, um, but that would explain the transcription style if he got
Okay.
back. And the rumor is that recording is out there, and someday they'll release it. But again, we're getting well into wish fulfillment territory. So
Yeah. Okay.
all of this is to say, this memo comes out after the death of astronaut Edgar Mitchell. The memo purports to cover a meeting between Dr. Eric Davis, astrophysicist, NASA, NIDS, all that kind of stuff, and Admiral Wilson. Admiral Wilson, at the time of this meeting in 2002, had just retired as the director of the DIA. He had also held a position known as
Wait, what is
J2,
DIA?
the Defense Intelligence Agency.
Okay, I don't, is that like the CIA? I have no idea.
It's Pentagon, basically.
Okay.
Um, the other
Hmm.
thing he had is he held a position known as J2, which is Director of Intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
Okay.
So, point is, Admiral Wilson, he ain't the top of the food chain, but he was pretty fucking high up there.
Yeah.
And specifically, as Director of Intelligence, he is one of the handful of people who, on paper, is supposed to be able to walk into
Should see anything.
any SAP in the
Yeah.
world and get a briefing, like
XAP.
full stop. Special access program.
Oh, special. Okay,
So
SAP. Okay,
these
got it.
compartmentalized groups within the Pentagon, on paper, certain members of Congress and certain high-ranking military personnel are always supposed to get access.
Interesting.
That's
And
part of
this,
why Wilson gets so
yeah,
pissed later in the memo, right?
yeah.
So the meeting is 2002, literally in the back of the car in a parking lot in Las Vegas, right after Admiral Wilson has retired. He's meeting with Eric Davis. The topic of the memo, the topic of their meeting, is Wilson telling Davis about something that happened in 1997.
Okay.
So we're finally getting down to the meat of it. Like, this is
Yeah.
what I'm telling you, right? It has this convoluted timeline. There's all
Yeah.
these
Yeah.
people
Yeah.
involved. So what the memo is actually about is in 1997, he had a meeting with Edgar Mitchell and some other people we'll talk about in a moment, who told him about the existence of some unacknowledged UFO programs.
Okay.
And he went looking for them, confirmed they were real, but could not get access to them, and called back one of the guys and told him it was real. What happened after that, which we'll talk about in a minute, is the news of that leaked, and Wilson took a lot of heat for that. So he is
From whom?
extremely skittish from the public. It was leaked in the Boston Globe.
Oh,
So
wow.
he says he was getting phone calls from like other members in the military who are giving him grief for believing in UFOs and little green men.
Sure. Okay. We both like end up coughing and drinking water at the same
Yeah.
time. Yeah, that happens.
Well, I'm muted, so we wouldn't have to know. But all right, if you want to acknowledge it in the recording, Chuck.
I mean, but we were both doing it at the same time. It would have been awkward. There's just like 40 seconds of mute.
That's true. Okay. So the main, I want to talk about this in two layers. I want to talk about the meeting between Wilson and Davis,
Okay.
and then I want to talk about what happened in 97.
Wait,
So
the first meeting?
before I
Oh,
dive
wait.
into,
Okay. Hang on. The meeting in 97 is the one that leaked. Is that right?
yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Okay. All right. Carry
So
on.
before I dive into any of these, we've covered a lot of confusing territory already. Any questions? Is this making sense?
Sort of. Okay. So Davis and Wilson, Admiral Wilson, are meeting to talk about a thing that happened in 1997. And
Yeah.
the thing that happened in 1997 somehow leaked to the public. And so, okay, I guess. So what are Davis and
Okay.
Wilson doing?
Yeah. So let's
why?
jump in here. So we know about this memo because it was in Edgar Mitchell's files. It leaked after he died. The memo is written by Dr. Eric Davis, who was a colleague of Mitchell's, and it covers a meeting between him and Admiral Wilson in 2002 in Las Vegas. The reason they were having that meeting, and Wilson talks about this in the memo, he says, Oak Shannon convinced me to meet with you. Oak Shannon is a Navy veteran and a retired Los Alamos National Laboratory physicist. He is also particularly interested in UFO stuff, but Los Alamos Navy, this is a guy with credentials, this is a guy with connections. He called up Admiral Wilson and said, I want you to meet with my colleague, Eric Davis, and talk to him about what went down in 97.
Okay.
The reason Oak Shannon knows about what went down in 97 is because it leaked, which we'll cover later.
Yeah, yeah.
But so Oak Shannon, this other guy, convinces Admiral Wilson to meet with him. Admiral Wilson is really skittish about this, and he mentions it several times in the memo, in the notes. He's like, I got burned doing this before. If you go public, I will deny any knowledge of this. Like, he is very clear. I am not putting my reputation on the line anymore. And Wilson even mentions, he's like, would you be willing to meet with some of my other colleagues and talk to him? And he's like, no, I'm all done. I'm not going to talk to anyone else about this again, ever. You're the last one. So he's been burned before, but he trusts Oak Shannon. Oak Shannon says you can trust Eric Davis. And Wilson basically runs a background check on Eric Davis, and everyone he talks to comes back and says, yes, you can trust this guy. He is rock solid. He knows what he's talking about, and he is not going to go public. He says, my sources were very clear. You're not looking to make a profit on this. You're not like writing a book. Like he says, just to be clear, what are you going to use these notes for?
Yeah.
And Davis says explicitly, they are for personal, private research only. And that seems to satisfy Wilson, and then he launches into the story.
Hmm. Okay. What personal private reason do you have to, I don't know. It's weird, but
Well,
carry
Davis
on.
is a UFO guy. Like, that is public. Like, Wilson would have known that. There's a reason he's talking to Davis, and Davis is looking to do more research into the topic, being able to confirm the story of Admiral Wilson failing to get access to UFO program. You can imagine how that would be useful to his group.
Yeah. Okay.
But
So maybe that
you kind
that
of hit a
helps turn
point
off some
nail
of
on the
it.
head, right? This whole thing is awkward. Why the
Yeah.
fuck would Wilson, a military man who respects the chain of command and uh, the laws of access, which is kind of the whole point of the story. He's upset that on paper he should have access and he couldn't get
Yeah.
it. What would lead this guy to casually go to a random scientist and tell him the whole story? Like,
Right.
that is another one of the common criticisms. What
Yeah.
I will say about that is the story was already out. It had
Yeah.
already leaked way back. There's a reason that Oak Shannon knew to ask Admiral Wilson to share this story with Davis. This wasn't
Right.
a untold story. This was a please give all of the details to my colleague Eric Davis because we've only heard this third hand.
Okay. So like I'm thinking about this from like code archaeology uh point
Yeah,
of
yeah.
view where like I know this person worked on this bit of code, but I don't know where the skeletons are and I don't know where their docs are and what stupid wiki
Exactly.
it's in. And like
Yeah.
maybe Admiral Wilson will know what hidden basement all the files are hidden in,
Oh,
and
no.
we can
A
get on
hundred
with our
percent.
work. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay. All
that's
right.
a
I'm
great
with you.
analogy, right? You are digging into code that you have inherited, and you get the opportunity to go have lunch with the programmer who worked on it for 10 years.
Right. Great.
Off the books, just tell me like what do I actually need to know? Oh yeah, okay, there's this file that I kept in, this
Yeah.
folder. Nobody knows about it, but it has all the access keys. Yeah,
Yes, exactly.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Okay. That makes
Very
sense.
much. That's the vibe here.
So
Yeah.
Admiral Wilson may just want to uh, want someone to continue that work, or clearly he
Yeah.
thought it was interesting then. So
Well,
maybe here's
and as
another
we get
group that
into it,
wants to
you
continue.
hit the
Yeah.
nail on the head, right? It is very clear that Wilson is super upset at
Yeah.
these unacknowledged groups from his perspective going rogue.
Yeah.
So a common criticism is why would this man who respects the letter of the law leak about it? Well, I think the reason he leaks it is because he's pissed off and he wasn't able to do anything about it, which is
Yeah.
what the memo is about. Um, so this is, I feel like the whole time we're talking about this, there is equal points in the likely and unlikely category.
Sure. Yeah.
Like if you're keeping a tick mark, like as we go down, right? The fact that they denied it sounds like a negative, but depending
But
on how you view it, it could also be kind of a tacit confirmation because it's exactly what you'd expect. The fact that he's talking to Davis sounds like a negative, but the reason he's talking to him fits with his character. The fact that there is a recording that is so verbose and accurate that it sounds like a movie script sounds like a negative, but it kind of makes sense if the guy has a photographic memory and maybe had a recorder on him. So
yeah.
it, you have to be able to suspend your disbelief a little bit at every level of this memo, but there is enough there that I find compelling. And thus far, I haven't found anything that makes me go, oh, this doesn't feel right. This doesn't feel true. So far, everything
Yeah.
I've heard feels like it could have happened. I'm not saying it did happen, but I'm saying it could have happened the way that it was
Yeah.
described.
Yeah.
So before I dive into
I'm
what
with it.
happened in 97, do you have any questions about the memo or about Davis or about their meeting, the kind of the 2002 onwards part of this story?
No, this all seems reason. I don't know. Whatever. Yeah. It's
Okay,
tracking.
no problem.
Yeah.
So we are now able to strip away a few layers of the onion and ignore them. So we are now
Yeah.
back in 1997. We are talking
Okay.
about what happened to Admiral Wilson in 1997, which is the whole focus of this memo. The memo is the conversation where Wilson is telling Davis this story. And there's some other layers there where he talks about some of the people involved and everything. But the meat of it is back in 1997, this happened. So remember, he's the director of intelligence. He's one of the guys on paper who's supposed to have access to everything. He receives a briefing. Briefing is a controversial word here. I'll circle back to that in a moment. He receives a briefing on the topic of compartmentalized government UFO programs from three people. Edgar Mitchell, who we've talked about before. You can understand why an admiral would have a meeting with a respected astronaut. Will Miller, who is a retired Navy guy, who again would have had connections, and Wilson probably would have been willing to at least meet with him and hear him out. And Stephen Greer, who is a name that immediately sets off red alarm bells in the modern UFO community. We've talked briefly about Stephen Greer before. The nutshell version of Stephen Greer is in the late 90s, early aughts, he did some really important work for the UFO community, notably the Disclosure Project, which involved a press conference at the National Press Club where he brought up a lot of former military personnel, but credible witnesses who all talked about UFO encounters on base. One of the guys talked about a UFO disabling a nuclear missile that they had fired. People talking about UFOs surveilling nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
It was a big deal. Kind of nothing came of it. The reason most people know Greer nowadays, and I should be clear, that we have a lot of respect for him. That the Disclosure Project, that was a big deal. He did a great job there. Since then, Greer has started putting out a lot of documentaries, which tend to be a bit self-aggrandizing. He talks about how the government has tried to kill him. He talks about how they offered to pay him $1 million to shut up. He has started running the CE5, Close Encounters of the Fifth Kind protocol, which is a thing he pays you to come on a CE5 trip with him, and has been debunked, unfortunately. On at least one occasion, he paid an airplane to fly by on the coast and drop flares and told all the people attending that those were UFOs. This is recorded on video. Flight logs have been lined up. My take on Stephen Greer is he's a guy that came into this with the best of intentions. He did absolutely the right thing. He got these credible witnesses together. He held a press conference, and nothing happened. And he kind of lost it, right? Like, well, what the fuck? Like, I brought you the good stuff. Why is nobody talking about this still?
So
and then
maybe
he got
can
heavily into the consciousness side. I think he thinks of himself as a bigger figure than he is. Anyway, he is a very polarizing figure. In 1997, he was a pretty credible guy. So Admiral Wilson receives a letter from Will Miller saying, me, my colleague Edgar Mitchell, and my colleague Stephen Greer want to come brief you on UFOs. Greer has been telling this story for years, and Greer said, I briefed a high-ranking military member on UFOs. And everybody's like, why the fuck would you, a retired surgeon, be briefing a military? That makes no sense.
No sense,
But we actually have the letter that Will Miller sent to Admiral Wilson now as part of FOIA stuff. It's come out. And they like very explicitly, they use the word briefing. Now, Admiral Wilson has said, yes, I met with those people because it's on the record. He can't really deny it. But they weren't briefing me. I was doing a favor to the sixth man to walk on the moon. He calls you up, says you want to meet, you hear him out for a little bit. What Greer and Miller and Mitchell say is they met with him. He extended their meeting. He kept blowing off other appointments. He'd call in his secretary, tell her, like, we're running this meeting long. When they left, he and Miller stuck around and kept talking for another few hours off the record. So the picture that they paint is that he was extremely engaged and sympathetic and not just humoring someone. The picture Wilson paints is, I was just doing a favor to a guy. Don't, what's the
Sure.
truth? Hard to know. But we do know this meeting did take place. It was called a briefing, at least in their request to him. And what they apparently came in and told him is the government has unacknowledged special access programs where they are reverse engineering crashed UFOs.
Hmm.
And he's like, that's a big claim. And they're like, here's a list of project names that you should go look into. So they didn't
Okay.
just come up
All
with,
right.
like claims of X-Files. They were like, these are the projects and you have access. You should go dig into them. So he says, I will. And he goes off and starts knocking on doors and making phone calls. And the memo goes more into this, but in a nutshell, a bunch of them he got through to, and they were like, we're not what you're looking for, but you need to go to this program.
Hmm.
So he ends up at this program. And long story short, I'll come back to the details here in a moment, but
Yeah.
sticking to the story of what happened in 97, he confirms the program is real and cannot get access to it. He
Okay.
is upset about this, as you might
Hmm.
imagine. He
Yeah. Right.
calls Miller. So they met in April. He calls Miller in June and says, you're right, the program does exist. Miller then tells Greer. Greer starts telling the story. So he's meeting with people. He's saying, we met with this high-ranking admiral, and he
Hmm.
had access to all the programs, and he said he'd go look into it. And he was so thrilled to hear from us, and then he couldn't get access, and he called us and told us I couldn't get access. And he was so mad. Leslie Kane, who was one of the authors on that New York Times story from 2017, wrote an article for the Boston Globe around this time where she interviewed Will Miller. And Will Miller also told her this story. So it
Hmm.
came out in a Boston Globe story. This is the point where Admiral Wilson starts getting blowback because while they don't identify him by name, it is incredibly clear through context who they were meeting with.
Oh,
And he
interesting.
starts getting flack from
Yeah.
other people who have figured it out. They're like, what the fuck, Wilson? Like, you're into this shit? Um, so he basically cuts off contact with Will Miller. And he badmouths him in the memo. Like, he's like,
Hmm.
the, Davis mentions we met with Miller and he told us that he could show us where the bodies are buried. He's like, I wouldn't listen to Will Miller. He's just trying to pay for his beachfront property. Like he's very down on Will Miller. And he explicitly says, there's a code, especially among naval officers too, like
Hmm.
back. So he's mad that Miller
Yeah.
especially violated his trust.
Right.
So you can understand why back in 2002, he's leaning on Davis pretty hard. Like, hey, man, the last time I talked to someone about this, it did not go well for me. I need to know you're not going to violate my trust here. So he's very adamant about, like, I got burned before. So before I get into the story about him trying to get access to the program, uh, that's the story of Wilson meeting with Greer and Mitchell and the story of how it came out later and kind of burned it. You got any questions about that?
Okay. So that was that like pages 1 and 2 or something. Um,
I don't know. The
okay.
memo does not make a whole lot of sense to me. Like I've read it repeatedly, but mostly what I have read is other people's summaries of it because it's written
Okay.
in this very kind of stilted
Yeah.
way where he's like labeling people's names and it's not written conversationally. So I personally find it very hard to track. All of this information is in there, but it is
Yeah.
not told in like a linear narrative of it was the summer of 97 and like they talk for a while about Will Miller, they talk about
Yeah.
why they're meeting, then they dive into the story, they pop back up a bit because Davis is asking him questions about what the program is, they go back down. Anyway, they're kind of all
Okay.
over the map.
Okay. That makes sense. So like I guess my real question is how much of the Wilson memo have we covered at this point? Like are we just starting the story or
Oh, I'd say like 60%, like the
okay.
structure.
All right.
The part
Cool.
that's left is the part that I think is most interesting. There's a
Oh, okay.
lot in here, But the thing that I think is most interesting is about Wilson finding the program and being denied access. The
Yeah.
details around that are really interesting.
Okay. Cool. Let's carry on. I think uh,
Yeah.
what you've talked about makes sense. So
Yeah. I apologize, by the way. Again, like you just mentioned, like, are we working through the memo? Like, no, that's part of why I'm trying to kind of tell this
yeah,
story in layers. Is I think that's how it makes the most sense to me. It's like
yeah,
there's the layer of like what happened to Admiral Wilson. There's the layer of him sharing that story and getting burned.
yeah,
There's the layer of him meeting with Davis. There's the layer of the memo leaking out of Mitchell's files, et
yeah.
cetera, et cetera. So
Well,
like
and
it's this story that
when I
is kind
think
of
about
accreted over time.
yeah, when I look at the doc, the like it starts with a letter, which made no sense to me, but
Yeah,
now actually kind of makes a little more
right.
sense. And because if it was just submitted into evidence, there might be six different files in there in different order, and like
Well,
yeah,
so that's part of it. So he mentions, you know, one of the reasons I'm meeting with Davis mentions to Wilson, one of the reasons I'm meeting with you is Will Miller came to our group and said he could put us in contact. And then there's a little parentheses like letter attached. And it's literally like paper clipped into the notes at that point. So when you're reading it as a PDF, it's just this random page that shows up.
yeah,
But if you were reading the actual thing, like it makes a little more sense that it's like it's on different paper stock and stuff like that.
yeah,
So
right. Okay, cool.
yeah.
Yeah, I'm good. Let's carry on.
So I've covered why I think this story is, if not credible, at least possible, and I find
Yeah.
it compelling enough that I want to believe. I don't
Okay.
think it's compelling enough to say this definitely happened. But what I will say is we have heard from many different sources now, all of which individually are not necessarily convincing, that the government has crashed UFOs and reverse engineering programs.
Sure.
Part of the reason I'm willing to lend this credit is across all of these stories, you look for the commonalities. What are they all saying? And they paint a surprisingly coherent and consistent story of these compartmentalized special access programs that have arguably gone rogue over the years. From what started as a legitimate need for secrecy to kind of a self-perpetuating beast of once you decide that you need secrecy, it's a lot easier to decide that you need more secrecy than it is to decide to open it up, you know. Um, so I find all of this very compelling in that there is a fairly consistent narrative being built of
Hmm.
assuming that the government recovered a downed UFO
Sure.
after, say, Roswell, or what a lot of people say is several downed UFOs across similar such incidents, where would they go?
Yeah.
At the time, they would have gone to the Air Force. The Air Force had a department that was responsible for evaluating downed Russian
Okay.
planes and things like that.
That makes sense.
Project Moondust, I think it was called, was literally like if a Russian jet crashes in a field in Wyoming, we have a team who is specifically designed to scramble and recover it so we can get it back and evaluate it before anybody
Yeah.
knows what's going on.
Right.
It's kind of easy to understand how UFO stuff kind of slot in there,
Slip
but
in
on
there.
paper it was
Yeah.
just for recovering foreign adversary stuff.
Okay.
So it would end up in the Air Force. But eventually, too many people know about it. And this is something we really need to keep secret. And we know the military knows how to keep a secret from Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project.
Right.
So the word is this literally went to Los Alamos and the Manhattan Project, which later became the Department of Energy.
Okay.
And then one of the things Wilson mentions in this document is at some point it was split off into private contractors so that fewer people in the military would know. And that's when it becomes these unacknowledged special access programs. And
Okay.
in
Yeah.
the story, Wilson gets a look at the bigot list, and the president's not on it. Congress members are not on it. There's one or two military personnel, but it's mostly private people. And
Interesting.
so again, this the story that Wilson is about to tell fits with this narrative that we have kind of heard across various disparate sources of how a program like this would go from a reasonably secret military program to an extremely secret government program to a compartmentalized run through private contractor program, all in the interest of nobody can know we're doing this.
Hmm.
So in 1997, Greer, Miller, and Mitchell brief Admiral Wilson on the existence of these programs, and they give him a list of names to go investigate. He starts knocking on doors, he starts making calls, and he ends up at what he says is the correct program. And they are not thrilled to talk to him. They're like,
Yeah.
how did you find out about this? Who told you about this? And he kind of tells them, and they're like, that's not great. You're not supposed to know about this. He's like, what the fuck are you talking about? I'm J2. I have access to everything. And he's pissed. And they end up agreeing to meet with him. And this is another one of the bits that the people who know how these military programs work, they find this particular bit of the story compelling. The people he meets with are the program's attorney, the program's one of the scientists, and the access person, the person who's in charge of controlling the access. So he meets with a group of 3 people. He sits down with them, and at first he's trying to ask them questions, and they're like not answering anything, and they're grilling him. Like it's unclear who's meeting with who. But basically, in the end, they end up telling him, okay, yes, this program exists. He's asking them, like, is this a weapons program? Is this this kind of research program? They're like, no, it's not a weapons program. It is not a military research program. We are reverse engineering a recovered craft. And they were pretty clear with him. They're like, we have not made a lot of progress, partly because we have to be so compartmentalized that we can only have in so many people, and they can't call anybody outside the program.
Right.
They said, our cover was almost blown during an audit. And I forget what year this was, but he mentioned some years before, the government conducted a budgetary audit, and they found a record of this program spending a lot more money than it was supposed to. And the auditor was threatening to blow their cover. And they finally ended up getting approval to bring the auditor in, give him access temporarily so he could see what the program was. And then they passed laws agreeing that they could be more restrictive about who has access. So on paper, J2 has access to everything. In reality, behind the scenes, they have worked with the Special Access Program Oversight Committee to agree that certain special access programs, especially these unauthorized ones, are exempt from those rules. They get to make their own bigot list, and they get to control it. And if you're not on the bigot list, you don't get access. I don't care if you're the fucking president. Nobody gets in who's not on the list. So Wilson's meeting with them. He's like, what do you mean I'm not on the list? I'm J2. They're like, you're not on the list, and we're not putting you on the list. You don't have a need to know.
Yeah.
So he's furious about this.
Yeah.
He says, well, I'm going to go to the Special Access Committee. And they're like, do it.
Yeah.
They are absolutely unintimidated by him. Yeah. They go as far as acknowledging the program is real. They tell him they're reverse engineering. And they won't tell him anything else. They won't take him there. They won't show him anything. They won't give him access or let him have oversight. Like nothing. You get to know the program exists, and we're basically only doing that to you because you're making so much noise. We're worried that you're going to go rogue. But they're like, this is legal. This is authorized. We do not have to give you access. He's furious about it.
Yeah.
He goes to the Special Access Program Oversight Committee, and he says, this is outrageous. I've found this program. They won't give me access. And the Special Access Program Oversight Committee says, they're right. You don't have access. You need to stop knocking on this door. This is outrageous. They're
Wow.
like, if you don't stop knocking on this door, uh, they tell him to drop it or be denied his promotion to director of the DIA,
Okay.
get early retirement, and lose 1 or 2 stars along the way.
Wow.
And
Huh.
like, you know enough about the military to know, like, you don't really fire an admiral, you don't fire a 4 star general. Like, but they are on a very clear career trajectory. At this point in time, it is obvious to everyone he is the next director of the DIA. And they're like,
Hmm.
you're not going to get that, and you're going to be demoted, and you're going to be given early retirement. Like, knock this off. So he's
Yeah.
forced to walk back and give up, and he's furious about it. And that's the point at which he calls Miller. And he
It's
tells Miller,
interesting.
you were right. I went looking, I found it. The program exists. They won't give me access. He's pissed. He tells Miller the whole story. Miller goes back and tells Greer. Greer starts telling the story. Later, Miller tells the story to Leslie Kean. It comes out in Boston Globe. Wilson takes
Yeah.
all this heat. He manages to kind of brush it off, but cut to 2002, which is only 5 years later.
Yeah. Right.
He's now retired, and as a favor to Oak Shannon, agrees to meet with Eric Davis and talk to him about this incident. But
Sure.
yeah, the meat of the whole incident is the J2, the director of intelligence for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, someone who on
Yeah.
paper should have access to everything, successfully uncovered the existence of an unacknowledged UFO special access program, reverse engineering, confirmed it existed, was denied access, and threatened if he continued moving forward with it.
Yeah.
That is a
Yeah.
wild fucking story. And again, right, like the kind of the whole theme of our show is like, whoo, if that's true, it's a very exciting time. There's a big question mark around if that's true in this case. But
Right. Yeah.
I
Yeah.
hope I have done a good job of showing you that there's the story being told is extremely plausible. It matches
Yeah.
everything that we know about how these programs are run. It matches narratives we are hearing from other unrelated people telling stories about these programs. It matches what we understand about Wilson as a person. It fits into the facts we are able to confirm, like the briefing that Mitchell gave him in 97. It fits the story that Greer has been telling for years, and it fits the story in the Boston Globe. So personally, I'm leaning towards thinking this might be true. And I'm 100% willing to admit that might be wishful thinking. It is definitely a damning factor that Wilson has explicitly come out and denied all of this. This isn't true.
Sure.
I've never
Yeah.
met with Eric Davis. I wouldn't be able to identify him in a lineup. I haven't been in Las Vegas since 1996, was one thing he said. Uh, so he is in no uncertain terms saying this is nonsense. But that's also exactly what he said he would do. So I don't know, man. Anyway,
Yeah.
that's the story of the Admiral Wilson document, dude.
Hmm.
What do you think?
I'm so like the one thing I find myself wondering about is like why would they have to go private? That that seems like it'd be easier to keep secret if it's all military. But maybe they just didn't have the expertise.
That is a 100% valid question. I want to say I'm sighing because it is a complicated, loaded question. I told you
Yeah.
before that like my dad worked IT for the state, and he was always of the opinion like if there is one thing the government is incapable of doing, it's keeping a secret. Like
Hmm.
for him, the existence of a secret UFO program was laughable because of the word secret. He could
Right.
believe there was a UFO program. The idea that the military would successfully keep it secret was unfathomable to him. But the
Interesting.
obvious counterpoint to that is the Manhattan Project, right?
Yeah,
And
right.
if this stuff went down the way that the narrative is building that it went down, which is it all comes out of 1947, that is immediately post World War II. It is literally the year the Air Force and the CIA were founded. Like the country is very much still in a war footing. We're
Yeah.
still used to thinking about compartmentalization and access. So I find it very believable. And again, I told you a few minutes ago about the kind of path this took, where it went from just being a regular top secret military program, like you're saying, to being a really highly classified one along the lines of the Manhattan Project,
Yeah.
to even that being insufficient. Still too many people know about this. Like when it was under the Department of Energy, the president could have come knocking and said, "You need to tell me about this." So they needed to
Right.
go another. Now, personally, I don't think they needed any of those layers of secrecy. I'm a disclosure advocate. I want them to come out and say, "Yes, this is true. We have this program. We don't know what it is, but we're working on it." But I can understand how a post World War II mindset heading into the Cold War leads you to make these kinds of extremely compartmentalized decisions. One of the things Tom DeLonge says, and I know he is an equally controversial figure, is that not only were there UFO crash recoveries in the US, but there were crash recoveries in Russia and China, and that these were less
Sure.
crashes and more deposits. And
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
again, if you're operating from the assumption of the US government has recovered advanced technology that it is struggling to reverse engineer, and they have every reason to believe that foreign powers also
Could
have
be.
this,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not great for us to come out and say we couldn't reverse engineer it, because what if they could? We just told them we
Sure.
have no way to fight you on this. Better to deny anything exists, or better yet, strongly imply this stuff is secret government technology. Maybe we have cracked it. So
Sure.
there's a lot to like. It's easy to slip into conspiracy land here, but
Yeah.
I find it very plausible that we could go from simply having this be a classified project in the military to a much more covert Manhattan Project style thing to an even more covert. This has to be given over to private industry with extremely limited government access, is a believable trajectory. I don't think it's a good place for us to have ended up at if it's true. I find it terrifying that, and this is what Admiral Wilson is saying also, that effectively at this point they've gone rogue. There
Yeah.
is no
Right.
oversight. There's not supposed to be anything in the military or the government with zero oversight. You can absolutely have limited oversight. You can have need to know, all that kind of stuff. But
Sure.
these guys have basically gotten to the point where no one knows them and no one can stop them. That's not a great place to be at.
Right.
So that was a really long, convoluted way of answering that.
Yeah.
Yes, on paper, I agree. It shouldn't need more than a simple classified military project, and you would think that would be enough. And I think if it happened today, maybe that is what would happen. But coming out of World War II, heading into the Cold War, I can kind of see how they could land at this.
Yeah. Yeah. Maybe. Um, yeah.
It's all
So,
speculation, though. Like,
yeah. Right.
this is again, right? Like, if you're a skeptic, like, this is the part where it gets like, man, you're building this whole house of cards around this might have happened. And if this happened, this might have happened. If that happened, this might have happened. Like, any one of
Yeah.
these things could be false, and the whole structure collapses. I 100% grant that.
Yeah. And I can imagine, uh, like what you're saying about, J2 being annoyed that there's no oversight on it. Like, I can imagine someone in
Mhm.
that position not being annoyed just because they don't have access, but being annoyed that like that a program has no oversight at all, especially one that could
Mhm. Mhm.
could very well be like uh, the future of the country, or could not. Like, I'm imagining like
Mhm.
uh, I think J2 or any of the Joint Chiefs would have similar concerns about the Manhattan Project if they weren't allowed to access it or know anything about it.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, that could be a
Mhm.
big problem. Um, like
Yeah.
this thing that could literally wipe us off the planet. Um,
Well, and I think it's also worth acknowledging that we are in a very different position as a country and a culture than we were in the 40s and 50s. In the 40s and 50s, there was hesitate to use the word patriotism, but there was very much a belief that, the government is doing what it needs to do, and you better fucking get on board.
Mm-hmm.
And now I think we are in a much more skeptical place when it comes to
Yeah.
believing that the government is doing the right thing and in our best interest. And it is definitely an artifact of our time and our culture that it is extremely easy for us to believe a story about, if not government abuse of power, at least dancing on the edges of what they shouldn't be doing and,
Right.
like coloring outside the lines a little bit.
Yeah.
But is that just an artifact of our time? The same way that if you told someone in the 40s that there was a secret government project and the president wasn't allowed to know, they'd go, well, there's probably a good reason for it. And now we're very much of the opposite opinion. There is no good reason for it. Well, maybe the truth's in the middle. Maybe sometimes there is a good reason.
Yeah.
This is the kind of stuff that I think about is, this is, okay. The UFO community as a whole tends to kind of fall into a few different camps. And one of them is, and this is a view that Stephen Greer espouses, the aliens are benevolent. They have never shown any sign of hostility. And the fact that the military and the government are taking the lead on this and actively using words like threat should be extremely concerning. Stephen
Yeah.
Greer has explicitly painted a worst case scenario of the government staging a false flag UFO attack
Sure.
as a rallying cry to increase funding and unify people against the threat of the aliens. Tom DeLonge takes the approach of, the government is lying to us for good reason. The truth is terrifying and upsetting, and the government is doing the right thing. And it's very much that kind of 40s, 50s, like, if the government's lying to us, it's for a good reason. So you got Stephen Greer like, the government is warmongering dictators who are out to kill us all. And you got Tom DeLonge saying the government is, rah-rah patriots who are doing the right thing to protect poor old us who don't know anything. And if we knew, we would be sobbing under our bed. I'm inclined to think that neither one of them is right. I'm inclined to think that if there are intelligent beings visiting this planet, they have their own motivations that may not align with human motivations. And it's not as
Right.
simple as, are they a threat or are they absolutely beneficial? I understand why people are skeptical of military taking the lead on UFO matters. I also
Yeah.
understand people who find it very comforting that if something was happening, that that the government is in there. And there are people who think that the government is abdicating their duties by not taking it seriously. So like, people
Yeah.
are all over the spectrum here. And I
Yeah.
think the
Everywhere.
problem is there's not enough information for us to know for sure. So it's easy to kind of project your own view of the world onto the situation. And if you are the kind
Right.
of person who tends to believe that the government in general has your best interests at heart, it's easy to fall into the idea of a benevolent black ops program. If you are the kind of person who believes that the government is generally inept and corrupt and causing problems, it's easy to project onto this unknown that the
Yeah.
government is this terrifying entity who's going to cause problems, and anything in between. I
Yeah.
don't know what I believe,
It's
but
probably both. It's so
right,
big.
exactly. And that's part of why I like this narrative that
Yeah.
we get out of the Admiral Wilson memo is it fits what we know about the government. The idea, the one thing that I do believe about the government is it is big enough that often the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing.
Oh yeah.
So the idea that a guy who on paper believes he should have access to everything finds out he does not and is upset about that and tells some people, I find that very believable and compelling, regardless of how
Yeah.
you feel about the government, whether this
Yeah.
program should exist. Like, this motivation, this character motivation, if I were writing a movie script,
Yeah. Right.
oh no, did I just convince myself it's a movie script? But you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
it tracks for me. It
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is it, again, I don't know if it's plausible, or I don't know if it's convincing, but I believe it is
Yeah.
plausible. The
Yeah. And
story depicted here feels like it could have happened the way it was told.
yeah, I wish I knew more about that arena. Um, like I've read some stories about generals and what it's like playing in that field, and it sounds like it is wildly different than
Oh
what
yeah.
you and I would expect. Um, and I find myself wondering, like, what tools does a Joint Chief have to deal with that kind of problem, where they
Mhm.
find a program that's gone rogue, and
Yeah.
like, what do they do? Like,
Well, and also,
for
how much is it worth rocking the boat, right?
right. Well,
If you're
and one of the
J2, you have a
things,
lot of things on your plate. And if you
yeah,
go knocking on the door of the UFO program and you're told, keep it knocking on this door and you're going to get demoted, well, you're also dealing with, I don't know, fucking Iraq war. You've got a lot of things occupying your concern.
yeah,
Uh,
that's more compelling to me. I have read that generals often they know that they will be demoted soon. Like that's just like a super common thing, and it's partly because there's a fixed number of starred
yeah,
generals, and so you know for a fact you need to move up or out immediately,
right.
and
Yeah, yeah.
um, and so like being threatened with a demotion that actually doesn't track to me. Um, Being pushed
Well,
out
remember, it was
does.
paired with early retirement. It
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
wasn't
That makes
early
sense.
retirement or losing 1 or 2 stars. It was you won't get your promotion, you will be forced to
And
retire, and you'll lose a star or two along the way, which is
and
going to
your
affect your pension.
pension will be smaller.
Yeah,
Okay, all right, great. Yes, now
absolutely. Yeah.
we've gotten back to the money. So now I buy it.
There we go.
It's apparently all I need. Yeah, no,
That's super fun.
regardless of how much I believe in it, it's a fascinating story, and
Right?
it's super interesting to chat about and cover. So I'm glad we got to talk about this,
Yeah. I mean, it's the whole theme of this, right? Like, I'm not
right?
saying it's true, but if it is true, woo,
Woo!
it's a very exciting time, Chuck.
That's right.
This was the Admiral Wilson memo, which has now been entered into congressional testimony and is therefore, as we all know, absolutely true.
Excellent.
All right. Well, that about wraps it up for today. Next time, I figure we'll just keep the controversy rolling. We'll move on to
Okay.
the next controversial UFO figure, a guy named Bob Lazar, who it is possible you have heard of, being the guy who informed the world about the existence of Area 51.
Oh, okay. I've always wanted to know about Area
Yeah.
51. So, yeah, that's
Yep.
exciting.
It's an interesting story, similar to the Admiral Wilson document. There is plenty to believe and or disbelieve here.
Okay.
We'll go into it a little bit skeptical, but it's an interesting story regardless.
Cool. All right.
So thank you for joining us on It's a Very Exciting Time. And Chuck, as always, my wife thanks you for listening to me talk about UFOs so she doesn't have to.